Hello YouTube, this is Gavagai. This video is part 2 of What's a Gavagai? And phase 2, this is just kind of a second part of introducing myself to the YouTube community. The first video, What's a Gavagai part 1, I gave a little account of my personal story and talked about how the process that I went through as I deconverted from being a devout evangelical Christian to a non-believer and an atheist. Really, this video is to kind of talk more about the channel, the YouTube channel, and my blog, talking about where the handle Gavagai came from. There have been questions about that in other video hangouts that I've done, and in fact, this morning I got a note on my YouTube channel, someone asking about where that name came from, Run Gavagai Run. So I'll talk about that. I'll also talk about the little furry avatar icon that I use. So as an undergraduate in college, I studied philosophy, and the first philosophy class that I took was part of a general requirements that the college had, and it was a class on ethics. And one of the arguments that was presented in the class related to moral relativism, and referred to this thought experiment by William Van Orman Quine, who was an American philosopher and talked a lot about meaning and language philosophy. And Quine's thought experiment places the reader in a situation referred to as radical translation, where you are kind of put into a culture that has had no contact with the outside world. There's been no attempt to translate their language or discern what meaning it is. You are the first contact that this tribe of peoples has had with the outside world. So as you approach the tribal people, a rabbit kind of scurries across in your field of vision, and the people notice it and they point and they say, "Gavagai." So you're trying to figure out what Gavagai could mean. Well, what are the possible meanings that they could have for saying Gavagai? And they might be just saying, well, hey, there's a rabbit. But they could also be saying, hey, there's lunch, or geez, I'm hungry. They might be also saying, behold the rabbitness, or that's our pet guy. There's our God. That's just a baby. They might be saying brown. They might be saying, furry tails are freaky, or grandfather's spirit has returned. Where's my spear? Or, hey, it's a good luck omen. And the list could go on and on. Well, Quine concludes that there are an infinite number of possible meanings, and without even being able to translate yes or no in this culture and what words they use to indicate yes or no, it becomes very difficult. Well, in the end, Quine believes that we are able to address this problem. I'm less familiar with the context that Quine has used this thought experiment in for his own purposes. I'm more familiar with the way that it's been used by other people. And so I can't really speak to the way that he goes about resolving the problem that he's identified using the Gavagai thought experiment. But in this context, that where I was exposed to this concept of Gavagai, the philosophers, there were philosophers who were skeptical that Quine was even able to resolve the problem. And some even went so far as to say, well, this really points to an issue that we can't resolve even with communication in people within our own culture, that there is no objective meaning between communicators, even within a culture, and that all meaning is inherently subjective, and there's really no way to objectively know whether or not we are communicating with other people. So how does that relate to the topic of ethics in this ethics class? Well, some philosophers take this and then apply that concept of meaning nihilism to the principles or the theory of ethics, or that philosophy, and say, well, if we can't communicate even more concrete concepts like objects and things like that with any objectivity, how then can we possibly convey things that are much more nuanced and abstract, like moral values? So they argue then that each person's conception of morality is subjective and just relative to their own meaning context. The ethics textbook tried to resolve the problem by saying, well, it seems like we can give a meaning, and we can communicate with each other, and we're able to do that. And this was an entry-level ethics class, and so I guess the author just felt, well, that's sufficient for this class, that they would be able to take that away from it and say, well, this is not a real problem. That bothered me, and when I read that in the textbook as I was studying for my exams and things, this occurred to me that this is just does not seem sufficient to address the problem of meaning and subjectivity within our languages and things. And I contacted my professor, and he said, yeah, you're right, that's not enough. You really need more meat to the argument than just that. But he said, well, for this exam, that's really all I'm going to hold you to account for this Ethics 101 class, essentially. So, it had the effect on me that I was really hooked at that point on philosophy, and I'd already been deeply engaged with the class and enjoyed it. But this particular puzzle and just the idea that this thought experiment related to meaning might be used and have implications on ethics theories and things like that. So the whole endeavor of philosophy really kind of gripped me. So what's my opinion? Can we actually exchange meaning and have kind of objective meaning between speakers in conversation and within our culture and in between cultures? I think the answer is yes. There are certain characteristics that human animals have in common. We have biological and social needs. We also have certain physiological responses to our world and interactions with each other. We have smiles and frowns and laughters and expressions of anger and fear and things that are kind of universal. And just being that we are human beings, human animals on this planet and this time, limits the number of possible meanings that we have in any given circumstance. And so I think that given time and data, we can infer and improve our accuracy and understanding, and of course, when there is less in common, if we have a new culture that we are encountering, and we don't know all of the metaphysical and different ontological concepts and constructs that this culture has embraced and believes, well, it becomes a bit more difficult, but it still is not insurmountable. There are basic biological and social needs that we can use to try and begin building an understanding of what's happening there. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where there would just be complete, I guess, intractability or complete barrier between the cultures when we have language barriers and things. And we can test these ideas. So, let's say we began to try and piece together meaning, and we had some maybe rudimentary ideas, and we wanted to test it. Well, we could put up, a barrier or a sheet so that there two people on either side of the sheet couldn't see each other, and one of the people could give instructions in whatever language they're using, and the other person could try and carry out those instructions. And you could test to see whether or not those two people were able to convey meaning, without being able to use other cues and things, just with the language that they have. And so we could test those things out. And what we're really using is induction and inference. We're making observations. We might start with looking at the way people communicate with children, and we could try and recognize patterns. Maybe they say evet, and they look angry when a certain child performs a certain task, and maybe they demonstrate how they intended the task to go, and then try and get the child to do it again. Or maybe they say dovi and look happy when the child appears to do the right thing, and then they dismiss the child and say, okay, go play or something. So we can identify relationships between phenomena. We can generate some hypotheses around that, and that might be negative or corrective, and dovi might be an affirmation or positive thing. It might be more nuanced than that, so we can test it out. We can say, well, are there exceptions? Are there problems? Maybe evet and dovi are only applied for children, and maybe there are different terms that are used for negation and affirmation when adults are talking to each other. But those, again, we can observe, we can test those things out, and try to come to better conclusions and refined conclusions. And we have to use these same kinds of strategies in everyday communication. We look for body language, we check for understanding when we're talking with people, so that we have better probability of accurately conveying the meanings that we're trying to convey. When infants are learning to talk, they use induction and inference just to figure out that we're using language and that words have meaning to begin with. And this also happens when we're learning a new language, and you say something and people give you kind of a funny look if you're learning a new language. Well, maybe you said the wrong word, maybe you mispronounced it and it means something else, or maybe it's just an awkward thing and it's just an etiquette issue that you have violated. But you can get clarification on those things in some cases and refine them. Once again, it's more difficult if there's less common reference. And Quine says, well, in some cultures in the real world, a nodding of the head means no, and shaking your head means yes. That becomes an obstacle. But if it's used consistently, and we can see that one is represented by one thing and the other is representative of another thing, we can apply that. If we went to encountered a completely alien culture with very different body language and things, and smiles indicated anger and frowns were indicative of happiness, yeah, it might take longer. But again, with some extended time and observations and things, it seems likely that we could put these things together and come to an understanding and build capacity for communicating and exchanging meaning between different cultures. And as we look through history, this has been the case. We have encountered cultures that have been uncontacted, and in every case so far, we have been able to break down those barriers and and exchange meaning with those other groups. So that's where Gavagai comes from. What about this furry little icon guy? It's not a rabbit. You've identified that. G-Man likes to call it the beaver-like creature, or that's what he said in the past. It's not a beaver. The real identity is a Neuralagus rex, according to biologists and archaeologists. They have concluded that it's an ancestor of the modern rabbit. Well, how do they know this? Well, they find skulls. The skulls have a rabbit-like appearance, but they are distinct. According to some of the websites and things that I've looked at from different biology and archaeology websites and things, they've said that the Neuralagus rex was maybe 10 times larger than our modern rabbits. So this is a big guy. But the bone structures and things most closely resemble the rabbits. So we use induction. We make observations. We see that there are layered rocks, and geologists tell us that the oldest layers are lower down and the newer layers are on top, the younger layers. We find that we can find rabbit fossils in the upper layers, the younger layers, but they kind of disappear as we go deeper. And we see a transition to these other larger fossils that are very similar, but they are very distinct. And so the rabbits had to have come from somewhere, and we can see that there was still life. There were living organisms, down. I forget how long. It was millions of years before our modern rabbits that the Neuralagus rex was found. But we can see that there was this transition, and it seems most likely that the rabbits came from this creature that was similar but different. Well, can we do the same with our human culture and biology? And yeah, it's pretty much the same. And in fact, we've actually got evidence of greater evidence for the transition of humankind. We have skulls and bones and fragments of skeletons that are similar to humans' skeletons, modern man, Homo sapiens, but they're distinct. And we can see that as we go back in time and further down in the rock layers to the older layers, that the modern skeletons of Homo sapiens disappear. They aren't there in the older records, and we see other human-like creatures that are very distinct, though, and they become more and more ape-like as we go further back. And so it just seems likely that that's where we came from. If you look at this from just a naturalistic perspective, and those are the kinds of inferences and induction that we use. And so the Neuralagus rex and the sun banner, those are kind of my nods to science. Why run Gavagai Run? Well, it's of course a nod to the Gavagai thought experiment. It's also a nod to the Star Wars scene where Obi-Wan Kenobi prompts Luke, "Run, Luke, run," and it's just kind of that duh kind of moment where Luke is standing there and he's being fired upon by all these stormtroopers, and apparently is too stunned to do what he needs to do to just preserve himself, and that always I found that humorous. I also enjoy the film Run, Lola, Run, and so it was a kind of a nod to that. And I just like palindromes, the idea of reading the same forwards and backwards is fun to me. Found a reference to the oldest known palindrome, Sator Arepo Tenet Opera Rotas, and that translates to the sower Arepo holds with effort the wheels. This was apparently scrawled in stone on some building. It's ancient graffiti palindrome. Just kind of a little trivia there. But that's really what this channel is about. That's what I'm interested in. Philosophy. I like ethics, epistemology, science, and theology. All of these topics are interesting to me, and I just like ideas and learning. The Gavagai theme, the Neurologus Rex, and the Sun Banner, all of these things represent one or more of those themes, and so that's why I've chosen them. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this content. I'm probably one of the least flashy as far as production value and things. My editing consists of, I didn't like that take, so I'm going to redo it. And I really don't put in very much flash or music or editing at all. But my interest is in thoughts and ideas, and if you have thoughts and ideas on my videos, please post comments, subscribe. There will be more to come, and also stop by my blog, Run Gavagai Run at blogspot.com, and subscribe. I'll post links to my first video and also to my blog in the description below. Thanks for watching.